All right, welcome back to the House Environment Committee. We are welcoming our legislative council to continue testimony on S 325, which is also going to potentially, when we're considering changes that were in our area of jurisdiction in S 328. I think you're going to present a little bit on that. And no, do I have this wrong? I thought you had your slideshow for that.
I was gonna do the slideshow on Act 181.
Okay.
What?
They went together. But that's okay. Let's do
Sure.
181.
Sure.
I thought you had a comments on the amendments from that we were looking at for 328.
No, and I think I already walked you through it.
Yeah, you did. We just took testimony on that. Okay, great. This is I just thought they were together for some reason.
Okay.
On 181.
Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah. So some of what this committee has been discussing is what element is in light of repealing Tier 3 and the road rule, what are the elements that are in there that you may want to consider addressing elsewhere? As well as what are the other outstanding projects that the Land Use Review Board has been reviewing. And so this series of slides are just copy and pasted from Act 181. The first couple go through the Tier 3 language and its process, and then the road rule and its process, and then the most, if not all of the other reports that are being worked on from Act 181. So Tier 3, there aren't very many mentions of Tier 3 in Act 181. It's fairly short, but you gave a lot of authority to the board to develop a lot of the concepts within it. So first, there is a jurisdictional trigger created for Tier 3. And so, as you know, in 6001, 3A, that's the list of the definition of development, which serve as the jurisdictional triggers for Act 250. So number 13 that was added is for Tier 3. And it reads the construction of improvements for commercial, industrial, or residential purposes in a Tier 3 area as determined by rules adopted by the board. So the jurisdictional trigger itself is pretty broad, vague. It's pretty vague. It delegated a lot of authority for the board to adopt rules determining how this jurisdictional trigger was going to work. You also added definitions in 6001 related to this. So Tier 2 is defined as an area that's not Tier 1 or Tier 3. But number 46 adds a definition for Tier 3. It means an area consisting of critical natural resources defined by the rules of the board. The board's rules shall at a minimum determine whether and how to protect river corridors, headwater streams, habitat connectors of statewide significance, riparian areas, Class A waters, natural communities, and other critical natural resources. You then provided a session law provision on what should go into the rulemaking process and what should be considered. So the Land Use Review Board, in consultation with the Agency of Natural Resources, shall adopt rules to implement the requirements for 6001 3A 13, Tier 3, and 6001 46, the definition of Tier 3, and definition 19, which is subdivision. So during the Act 181 bill process in committee, you were considering whether or not the definition of subdivision should also be amended to address how subdivisions would be treated in Tier 3. So as you know, Act 250 jurisdiction, the need for a permit is triggered either by the construction for development or construction of subdivisions, so the subdividing of land. And I think you talked about recently It's in towns with zoning. Currently, the statute is that it's the subdivision of 10 or more lots. In towns without zoning and permanent subdivision bylaws, it's 6 or more lots. And if lots are going to be offered at public auction, it's 5 or more lots. So you did not make any changes in Act 181 to the definition of subdivision, but you do ask further down on here if there should be a consideration for how Tier 3 works in relation to the subdivision of land. You then included an intent section as part of the rulemaking. So it is the intent of the General Assembly that these rules identify critical natural resources for protection. The board shall review the definition of Tier 3 area, determine the critical natural resources that shall be included in Tier 3, giving due consideration to river corridors, headwater streams, habitat connectors of statewide significance, riparian areas, Class A waters, and natural communities. Any additional critical natural resources that should be added to the definition, measures to ensure that no municipality or region is disproportionately impacted by Tier 3 designation that would limit reasonable opportunities for Tier 1 or Tier 2 designations, and how to define the boundaries. Rules adopted by the board shall include any necessary clarifications to how the Tier 3 definition is used in Act 250, including whether and how subdivisions would be covered under the jurisdiction of Tier 3. Any necessary changes to how the jurisdictional trigger should be administered and when jurisdiction should be triggered to protect the functions and values of resources of critical natural resources. The process for how Tier 3 areas will be mapped or identified by the Agency of Natural Resources and the board. It goes on. And other policies or programs that shall be developed to review development impacts to Tier 3 areas if they are not included in the definition of Tier 3. And if a critical natural resource area is not recommended for protection under Tier 3, it shall be identified in the rule and a rationale shall be provided as to why the critical natural resource was not selected for Tier 3 protection. And so you had provided them a list of the 6 natural, I believe it's 6 that they shall consider: the river corridors, headwater streams, habitat connectors of statewide significance, riparian areas, Class A waters, and natural communities. And you asked them to look at whether or not those are already covered by another program and protected, and then to address in the rule how they're protected and why they're not going to be included in the rule.
It's very striking. I mean, it was to identify the process for how Tier 3 areas will be mapped, not to map them. Not what we asked them to do.
And then finally, as part of this rulemaking section, the rule, they were supposed to, by January 1, 2025, convene the working group to provide input on the rule prior to pre-filing it with ICAR, the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules. And these are the stakeholders that were listed in the statute, in the session law provision. So they had to include representation from regional planning commissions, environmental groups, science and ecological research organizations, woodland or forestry organizations, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, the League of Cities and Towns, the Land Access and Opportunity Board, the State Natural Resources Conservation Council, and other stakeholders, such as the Vermont Ski Areas Association, the Department of Taxes, Division of Property Valuation and Review, the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Vermont Woodlands Association, and the Professional Logging Contractors of the Northeast. Additionally, so the due date for the rule was supposed to be filed by February 1st of this year, 2026, and then also submit a report describing the rules and issues reviewed to this committee and the Senate committee. And then also subdivision D was included. So during the rule development, the stakeholder group established under subsection B shall solicit participation from representatives of municipalities and landowners that host Tier 3 critical resource areas on their properties to determine the responsibilities and education needed to understand and manage and interact with the resources. Oh, I had a education needed to understand, manage, and interact with the resources. Okay. So also in Act 181, as you have discussed, the road jurisdictional trigger. This was added as 6001 3A number 12. So again, part of the definition of development as to what would trigger Act 250 jurisdiction. So unlike tier 3, there is a very long statute on the road jurisdiction and a very short rulemaking section afterwards. So a lot more detail in the statute on the road rule. So an Act 250 permit would be needed for the construction of a road or roads and any associated driveways to provide access to or within a tract of land owned or controlled by a person. For purposes of determining jurisdiction under this subdivision, any new development or subdivision on a parcel of land that will be provided access by the road and associated driveways is land involved in the construction of the road. Jurisdiction under this subdivision shall not apply unless the length of any single road is greater than 800 feet, or the length of all roads and associated driveways in combination is greater than 2,000 feet. As used in the subdivision, road includes any new road or improvement to a Class 4 highway by a person other than a municipality, including roads that will be transferred to or maintained by a municipality after the construction or improvement. So private roads, not constructed by the municipality or the state. Routine maintenance and minor repairs of Class 4 highway shall not constitute an improvement. Routine maintenance shall include repairing a culvert or ditch, applying new stone, grading, or making repairs after adverse weather. Routine maintenance shall not include changing the size of the road, changing the location or layout of the road, or adding pavement. For purposes of determining the length of any road and associated driveways, the length of all other roads and driveways within the tract of land constructed after July 1, 2026 shall be included. And so you will recall that this section still has not taken effect yet. It's to take effect on July 1, 2026. And so that marks new roads constructed after that date, not already existing roads, are what could trigger the Act 250 permit need.
Representative Sakowicz has a question.
Ellen, do we have a definition of roads or driveways somewhere?
No.
Yeah, Representative White.
Is that gonna be the factors that what makes something a road or a driveway? Is that something that is like maybe left to rulemaking? I thought I heard that.
So there is a rulemaking section after this.
Yep.
Giving authority to clarify any necessary parts of the provisions of the rule. I think in discussion, the concept is that a driveway generally only provides access to a single property. Road has more uses, but defining a road is one of the issues historically with this type of provision.
Thank you.
But it does go on to say what is not a road for these purposes. So,
Representative Norris has a question.
oh, sorry.
This might just be a silly question, but Ellen, I thank you for explaining this all to us, and it's helpful. Does this all fall under like a paragraph that says this is when Act 250 jurisdiction applies? You keep saying Act 250
Yeah.
jurisdiction. It doesn't say that anywhere in these words. I'm just, is this in that section? Or wondering how that.
Yeah, so the reference up here at the top, 6001 3A 12.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the language in the statute that this is the definition of development. And Act 250 jurisdiction is triggered by the construction of a development or a subdivision. Yes. Yeah, and it's a little bit of a long road, so
Yeah.
6081A is the primary language about when something needs a permit, and it says construction of a development or subdivision. And then we use the definition of development, 3A, as a list. And so currently it's 13 items long, what's included in the definition of development. It also says what development does not include. And then there's also a definition of subdivision. And so what's under development and subdivision are the jurisdictional triggers.
By that fact, thank you. The implementation mechanism for controlling things within these areas, including tier 3 and the road, is Act 250. That is implemented. That wasn't a choice by the local.
Well,
That was the choice of the legislation to say this is going to be Act 250 jurisdictional triggers
well,
because of where we're placed.
I think that this, to me, is saying that not not necessarily in tier 3, but yes, in the road construction. So we left the tier 3 program, I think, more definable. We wanted recommendations. We wanted,
In terms of what the mechanism for implementation.
right, how would we work with landowners?
Yeah.
To work to protect these
Okay, that was
resources?
part of my question. Maybe again, I misunderstood the answer. So are both of these road restriction and tier 3 within the section that defines, here's when Act 250 applies?
Yes,
They both are.
they're next to each other. Yes.
That's different from what I.
Different jurisdiction.
Separate and jurisdictional triggers, but still triggering Act 250 as the controlling mechanism.
Yes.
Right, except that tier 3 was really open-ended, so it's not implied that all of the Act 250 criteria would apply to a tier 3 area.
So it even says, so on this third slide, 1, 2, 3, any necessary changes to how the jurisdictional trigger should be administered and when jurisdiction should be triggered to protect functions and values of resources.
It's still jurisdiction of Act 250.
Sure.
Okay.
Representative Chapin.
I mean, I think what you're bringing up, Representative North, is sort of like the conundrum that we've sort of witnessed play out. And it's that tier 3 was set up in here to be a potential development under Act 250. But it also gave all this language around, we want you to like look at all these different natural resources and identify ones that are already covered by other permit programs. And maybe make recommendations to us about how, if you don't think this should be under Act 250, how it could, like, it's very verbose, and I think was intended to give clearly a humongous amount of latitude to LURB, which is a brand new formulated thing. It is not full of natural resource specialists, full of planners and process folks. So I think that that's sort of how we got here, is that not everybody who crafted this language presumed necessarily even any of that would end up under Act 250 jurisdiction, or at least not for like single family homes. Maybe it would if it was a larger development or subdivision. So like, I think
Except for
there was just so much.
It's in the statute.
Exactly. And so when you're a literal entity that's brand new, you might take that to like just focus on where is Act 250 going to apply. So I guess I think this is where we had a lot of different room for interpretation and intention and got into a narrow place with it. Yeah, that's not the case for the road rule. Road rule is clearly just about Act
Trying to be
250.
clear.
Also, add something, so, but I will say, even with first of all, nobody should have seen tier 3 maps.
It says in here,
Like,
how will
they
they be
shouldn't have-
mapped?
That should never have been put out into the world. That was unfortunate. I'd also say that the initial maps, I believe, mapping out the road rule were just factually incorrect. Because they did not assume driveways, they assumed roads. Like, it was just,
It's premature in that
Premature.
instance as well. I mean, I also would say in the tier 3, slide 4, other policies or programs that shall be developed to review development impacts to tier 3 areas if they're not included in the definition of development. So it is saying they may not be included in the definition of development.
Yeah, and I guess I would also just add, I find the way that tier 3 statute is phrased is significantly more vague than the other Act 250 jurisdictional triggers. And I don't feel could have actually worked unless the rules were formally adopted. Because you can't just look at the statute and know who's going to be covered by it, which is not how we try to craft laws. So it would have needed the rules in order for people to understand how the law would have impacted them.
And Logan.
And I just add to that, we made it intentionally vague so that there could be a community-driven process around defining what tier 3 even meant. And certainly how it functioned.
Yeah,
And that, you know,
meant to be that.
yeah. And here we are.
And here we go.
Representative.
I just want to say that I do think this, is a good opportunity to not lose how we got here and try to avoid that situation again, at least learn a lesson from this. So we're not here because it sounds like there was a lot of misinformation presented as reality and, validly people were upset, but it wasn't based on, it wasn't accurate. And that's, I think, unfortunate.
So on slide 7, still in the statutory jurisdictional trigger for the road jurisdiction, subdivision 4 here in the middle of the page. So it says what is not included in a road. So it shall not apply to a state or municipal road. So we're talking about just private roads. A utility corridor of an electric transmission or distribution company, or a road used primarily for farming or forestry purposes. Development within Tier 1A or Tier 1B, and improvements underway when this section takes effect to a Class 4 highway that will be transferred to the municipality. So roads constructed in Tier 1A or B were not going to be included. The conversion of a road for farming or forestry purposes that also meets the requirement of the subdivision shall constitute development. And this committee had a lot of discussion about forestry roads often start as just a trail to get the logs out of the forest, but then what if people build houses along them? So there's contemplation that it could apply to things if farming or forestry roads started being used for development. And then finally, the intent of this subdivision is to encourage the design of clustered subdivisions and development that does not fragment Tier 2 areas or Tier 3 areas. So then there was also a rulemaking section significantly shorter than Tier 3. So the board may adopt rules after consulting with stakeholders, providing additional specificity to the necessary elements of the road construction statute. It is the intent of the General Assembly that any rules encourage the design of clustered subdivisions and development that does not fragment Tier 2 areas or Tier 3 areas. You gave them the option on this for May. They may adopt rules because this statute is significantly more specific than Tier 3. And so whether or not you need rules to give additional specificity was up to them. And I think they issued a guidance document instead, which does not require the full rulemaking process or a draft guidance doc. I don't know if I believe they were working on guidance as opposed to a full rulemaking. So earlier this session, you did hear about the appeals report that you asked the Land Use Review Board to undertake as part of Act 181. But there were a number of other reports in Act 181 that you asked the Land Use Review Board and agencies to work on also. So another one that is relevant to this conversation you're having around the location-based jurisdiction is the Tier 2 area report. So that was due February 15th of this year. It says the board shall report recommendations to address Act 250 jurisdiction in Tier 2 areas. And that is because in the statute, Tier 2 is just things that are not Tier 1 and Tier 3. And so there were no changes made to the way Act 250 functioned in that area, with the exception of if the road rule was going to take effect. That would have been the change in those areas. Otherwise, the other Act 250 jurisdictional triggers that exist would have functioned as normal. So asking them for recommendations that shall recommend statutory changes to address fragmentation of rural and working lands while allowing for development. Address how to apply location-based jurisdiction to tier 2 areas while meeting the statewide planning goals, including how to address commercial development, and which shall also include review of the effectiveness and mitigation of impacts on primary agricultural soils, and make recommendations for how to improve protections for this natural resource. Review of the effectiveness of jurisdictional triggers for development of retail and service businesses outside village centers, and criterion 9L in addressing sprawl and strip development, and how to improve the effectiveness of criterion 9L. Prior to Act 181, 9L was the most recent jurisdictional trigger that had, or criterion for review that had been included, and it was it's to address sprawl and strip development when seeking an Act 250 permit. And review of whether and how Act 250 jurisdiction over commercial activities on farms should be revised, including accessory on-farm businesses. Which in Act 181, we're given a specific exemption as defined in Act 181. So Section 35 of Act 181 also had a wood products manufacturer report, and you heard about this earlier this session because H 932 came out of the recommendations of that report, which was more about supporting the forestry and logging industry generally, as opposed to just specifically the forest products manufacturers. And then also Section 36 had another related report, location-based jurisdiction review report. This one is pushed out a few years because it's checking in on how the jurisdiction framework was working. So on or before February 1, 2029, the Land Use Review Board shall review and report on the new tier jurisdiction framework used to establish location-based jurisdiction for Act 250. The board shall report on the outcomes and outline successes and any changes that are needed. The board shall undertake an in-depth review of the Act 250 updates, including the duties and responsibilities of all the staff and the board itself, specifically whether the updates have reduced appeals and whether the updates have created more equity and cohesion among the district commissions and district coordinators. And that relates to part of the Act 181 that we haven't talked about in committee in a while, which is the first dozen or so sections of Act 181 talked about changes to the Land Use Review Board, going from the Natural Resources Board to the Land Use Review Board, giving them some additional staff, including executive director and additional attorney, and making members full-time, because there were a lot of discussions about cohesion among the district commissions and coordinators and making sure there was consistency to the extent possible. All right, and then I think this is the last one. No, there's two more. So Section 37 was an affordable housing development regulatory incentives report. This one has also already been completed. It's from the Department of Housing and Community Development with the Housing and Conservation Board, the Land Access and Opportunity Board, and the Vermont Housing and Finance Agency. They shall engage with diverse stakeholders, including housing developers, local government officials, housing advocacy organizations, financial institutions, and community members to identify regulatory policies that incentivize mixed income, mixed use development, and support affordable housing production as a percentage of new housing units in communities throughout the state, including examining the impact of inclusionary zoning, and develop recommendations for legislative, regulatory, and administrative actions to improve and expand affordable housing development incentives within state designated areas. And then finally, there was another report. I'm sorry that my font on here got so much smaller than the other ones, but and PowerPoints aren't my strong suit, sorry. So Section 37A was a transportation support study. There is a mechanism in Act 250 that we haven't discussed in this committee, I don't think in a while. Transportation impact districts and transportation impact fees, which the district commissions have the authority to collect fees from projects that are going to have traffic impacts so that those fees can go towards the traffic impacts so that, adding another lane or a stoplight to improve traffic efficiency so that so that one development doesn't have to take on all those costs. They're spread across multiple developments. And so potentially one of the impacts of tier one would be that in those areas, those developments would not contribute to the traffic mitigation. And so that's what this report was looking at. So on or before December 15, 2025, the Agency of Transportation, after consultation with the Department of Housing and Community Development, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, which are the regional planning commissions, and the Natural Resources Board, shall review the revenue collected by the state, both current and projected, for transit support through Act 250, and the revenue and benefits to developers, to the state, and to the community received through transportation impact fees, and shall suggest processes to preserve these revenues, requirements, and benefits. The agency shall consider including transportation demand management and subsidies requirements in development review authority for municipalities, the authority or ability of the Agency of Transportation to enforce transportation impact fees as part of the municipal process, and any other proposals. They shall hear from a diverse group of stakeholders, including developers, local government officials, alternative transportation organizations, transit providers, and financial institutions. And that report was due December 15, 2025, and it was submitted by the Agency of Transportation.
Might have said this, but was the affordable housing one also submitted?
Yes, it was submitted on January 15, 2025. It's at the very end. And I can't remember if you took testimony on it.
Put up, I'm sure it's on our webpage. Thank you, this is very helpful. Members have questions? Lots more to read. It's just a little teaser to get you to read all of Act 181.
There you go.
Yeah.
Many good things in there, despite the publicity. Thank you, Ellen. So members, right now I don't think we have anything on the agenda tomorrow because we don't actually know, like, will the floor be long or short, but I guess I'll say stay tuned. And we may just come back, we'll see where we're at. Maybe discussion, or maybe break into small work groups, or I'll do a temperature check with all of you, or feel free to check in with me. That we're adjourned for the day.